Welcome, everyone. I'm Rita McGrath, and welcome to this week's Friday Fireside Chat. I'm absolutely delighted to have Adam Bryant join me. Adam is, among many other things, the author of the Corner Office column at the New York Times, recently a co-author of this fantastic book, which I've really been enjoying reading, called The CEO Test. And what I like about it is every word in the book matters. It's really a very carefully edited book. It's not a long book, but it's a very rich book. So I'm really pleased to welcome you here. And now you are a managing partner at Merrick. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah, I left the Times in 2017 to join Merrick, and we do executive mentoring at the C-suite and also do a lot of work with teams around leadership development.
Yeah, and I know you've had folks from Merrick teach at our Columbia Executive Education programs. I know we've had a lot of Merrick presence at our advanced management program and other senior things. And what I mean, to spend just a minute on Merrick, it's so you have actually got CEOs mentoring CEOs, which I think is a very interesting.
Exactly. And I do think there is kind of an X factor there. Just if you're going to be a coach or a mentor, the fact that you sat in the chair yourself and felt that weight of responsibility on your back while you're trying to juggle, family life and all those things, I think it brings a different level to the quality of the conversation.
Oh, it absolutely does. And, a lot of things that, other people don't understand that you really do when that's your job. One of my colleagues is Ron Boar, who has had a number of CEO roles in the past. And there's never a conversation with him where he doesn't raise something. And I go, well, I wouldn't have thought of that, and I think it's exactly that kind of moment of what,
right.
What?
To constantly be living in the gray areas and everybody's second guessing you. And, it's a cliche, but it happens to be true. It's such a lonely job. So,
oh, yeah. I mean, you come into the meeting room 3 minutes late and there's all kinds of conjecture about why that happened.
We must be getting sold.
There's a wonderful story, and then we will get on to the main thing. But the CEO of the SAS Institute, brilliant guy, and one of the things they're famous for is M&Ms. So they have these giant goldfish bowls full of M&Ms all over the company, and it's best place to work. I mean, really,
right.
Really a very well regarded place. And he said he was concerned about the health effects of, having so much sugary stuff available constantly. And the fact that they're always in these goldfish bowls means people are just diving in. And he said, but, I can't get rid of the M&Ms because if I took the M&Ms away, it would create all these rumors like we're getting sold, the company's not doing well, oh my God, we're under budget pressure. And so he finally got inspiration from Google as to how to solve this problem. And so what he did was he replaced the goldfish bowls with ceramic M&M containers, so you couldn't see them. So they weren't calling you.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
So let's talk about this book.
Sure.
What maybe some of the backstory, what prompted you to write it?
Yeah, well, it probably helped to start, it's kind of my beginning in this sort of leadership space, which the story starts in 2009 when I was at the New York Times. I had been a business reporter for many years, interviewed a lot of CEOs and really became intrigued with them as sort of people and their backstories. And so I launched this corner office feature, and it was based on a very simple what if, Rita, which is what if I sat down with CEOs and never asked them a single question about their companies or their industries, and instead just ask them about leadership lessons they've learned over the course of their lives and how they think about culture and teams and hiring. I mean, it was sort of the opposite of what newspapers do, because my interviews were meant to be timeless, not timely. And that just sparked, a decade run doing the Corner Office series, 525 weeks, never missed a single week, wrote a couple of books, based on the themes and patterns that emerge from those interviews. So in terms of the backstory of this book, I think it was CEO number 5 that I interviewed was this guy, Kevin Scherer, who at the time was the CEO of Amgen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He and I stayed in touch. We'd see each other every few years. But then in 2018, we got together for breakfast in New York, and he sort of floated the idea of what about writing a book together? And I instantly liked the idea. And the image that leapt to mind was sort of if we could create the metaphorical T, if you will, in this, so far as the horizontal would be me, the breadth of my, by now, more than 600 interviews with leaders and all the insights and patterns that I've seen there. And Kevin would be the vertical part of the T, just in terms of the incredible depth of his experience, not only as a CEO, board member, taught leadership at Harvard. He's been involved in 20 CEO successions in various capacities. He's also a mentor now. And we just thought that if we could combine that, it could lead to something pretty powerful. So that was kind of how this project came about.
Well, and Amgen, famously incredibly profitable company. But in the book, you talk about, even though things were going great, he faced this moment of reckoning when he had to really reinvent himself. And not very many people do that in life, I don't think.
No, it's true. And Kevin will be the first to tell you that, he did get into this. I won't go into the details of the whole Epogen and this particular drug and blood cells and all that, but there was this crisis. And he will be the first to tell you that he's a bit surprised that he managed to survive it. But it was this incredible epiphany. And the way we've structured the book, Kevin plays this role that I liken to sort of player coach. Obviously, he was a co-author of the book, but there are some of his stories that provide anchor anecdotes for some of the chapters. And we did do this chapter on listening, and I often think that you don't really see courses on listening in business schools, but I think there should be, because it's not just about kind of listening in the moment, one-on-one or with small teams. It's just the importance of, first of all, recognizing as a leader that you're in a bubble and all the information that comes to you is kind of massaged and you don't really know what's really going on. But then sort of proactively creating an ecosystem or infrastructure, if you will, in the organization so you can get real and reliable data on what people are thinking and feeling. But Kevin had this epiphany where, Amgen went into this crisis, and he tells this pretty memorable story where he was at this restaurant in Santa Monica. He was waiting for his daughter to show up. She was stuck in traffic, and he had time by himself. And there was this kind of paper tablecloth in front of him, and he just realized, you know what? I have not been owning responsibility for what happened. And he just started writing a list of all the things that he did wrong and that he had to own. And just from that moment on, he sort of changed the way he listened. And part of the reason the company got into that crisis, because he says he wasn't listening to the signals. And he also, I'm often struck by this moment that we're living in, Rita. I mean, it's such a profound moment of transformation, right? The role of companies in society, the nature of work and leadership itself. And I think we can call this sort of official death of command and control leadership this year, right? We know that's not going to work anymore. But again, Kevin would be the first to tell you that was his model for leadership growing up. And that he would even say that he would be in meetings with people and say, look, just in the spirit of time, I know what you're going to tell me. I know what I'm going to tell you. I know what you're going to say to me. So I might as well skip all over that and tell you what I think and what you should do. And I'm not exaggerating. That's the story he tells. And so to me, that's the definition of command and control leadership. Right. And as he says, that worked for me for a very long time. And then we write new paragraph until it didn't, right? And so there was this kind of incredible moment of lesson for him. And it really is pretty impressive. And we've got lots of examples in that chapter of what CEOs do. But I think the first part is really this kind of self-awareness that you are in a bubble. You probably, a lot of people have probably heard that expression, careful how funny your jokes become when you become the boss, right? And anybody who's worked in an organization who's seen that movie where the boss tells a joke that isn't very funny and everybody's sort of laughing at it like, they're Dave Chappelle or something.
Well, my jokes are funnier, my decisions are wiser, and I'm actually taller.
And you're better looking, it's amazing. It's totally transformative. Just those 3 letters on your business card.
It's amazing. Absolutely. So one of the models that I talk about in my most recent book is really about how leaders have to get out to the edges and how you have to get this flow of information from the edges of your organization to the corner office. What might some examples be? Because people are always asking me, how do you do that? Because I think it's one thing to be aware you're in a bubble. It's another thing to figure out what to do about that, right?
Right. And I do think it does. It's kind of like retail politics. You have to get out there and set up the skip level meetings, the breakfast, the coffees, and just spend time with people. And I think part of the strategy and tactics are having provocative questions, right? To say to people, like, imagine I was a new CEO here, like, what do I need to know that I don't know? Right. And just having these, stopping people in the hall and saying, like, what should I be hearing? I like this strategy that some CEOs use with new hires. And they will say to them on the first day, look, I want you to come back to my office in 6 months because I want to hear from you. Like, what were you doing at your old company that we should be doing here? And just, it's all, to me, so much of it is about sending the signals that you want to hear it, that you genuinely, authentically, and when people bring you what might be troubling or bad news, you thank them, you make a big deal out of it, right? Because, we quoted in that chapter on listening, Nell Minow, who was a shareholder activist for many years. And she said, the companies that we invested in, they all had the same quality of the CEO, that everybody in the companies would say that, if you disagreed with the CEO, you could get fired on the spot. Right. And sort of understanding that you have to do the complete and utter exact opposite of that. And just, a good example to me is one CEO I interviewed. He has this rule in with all his employees. It says, if there is bad news, I want you to text me right away. And if you have good news to share, wait till we're talking on the phone or in person or over Zoom or whatever. And then you ask, well, why is that? It's like, because the sooner we get the bad news out, the sooner we can fix it. So just creating that environment, because first of all, like, to me, it always reminds me of so many leaders say, I have an open door policy. I'm an open door. It's like, yeah, your door is open. You just don't want anybody to come in. Right. And so it has to be authentic, because I think there's just some natural skepticism. It's like, you say that, but do you really mean it? So you have to show over and over, yes, I really mean it.
Yeah, I've done a bit of work with Alan Mulally, formerly of Ford, and he talks a lot about you can't manage a secret, which I think is
that's good. That's a great phrase.
Just a brilliant sort of way of encapsulating that.
Yeah.
So in the beginning of the book, so the first thing you talk about is you have to make the strategic plan simple enough that people really get it. And as I was saying to you earlier, there's a phrase in that chapter that just struck me as so true. It's like, you have all these bunnies and they're in a box, and you think they're in the box, and then they just, over time, they just kind of hop off somewhere.
You turn your back.
Your job is to try to kind of get them back in the box.
Right. Because it is, as we were talking about earlier, like, it is human nature that it's just, you give people sort of time and space, and they start creating their own narratives about how they are, their part of the business is helping drive the strategy. And that's how you kind of lose that alignment. But we do start the book with this idea of around the idea of strategy and a simple plan, because, at the risk of stating the obvious, like, that's the cornerstone of the foundation, right? Like, everybody says culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think in a very narrow context, that's probably true. But the longer I spend in this space, the more I realize how much culture is actually driven by strategy. That if you get a clear strategy, and I've heard from so many CEOs, you get it right and you can see the impact it has on morale. Because I do think employees are owed the answers to just a couple of simple questions, like, what should I be doing and why is it important? And that only flows out of clarity around the strategy. And what's been interesting, part of my education, doing corner office, and now in this new chapter of my career as a consultant, I've really come to understand that this word strategy is kind of a Rorschach test or classic ink blot. I mean, I didn't go to business school. I always assumed that if somebody said strategy, that everybody kind of knew what it meant and agreed, saying we all agree a glass of water is a glass of water, but strategy is not that. And when we work with leadership teams, I'm always struck by, we often start off like, just what's your strategy? And the patterns that I've seen are that, the metaphor that I use is one of altitude. And so you just say, what's your strategy? And some people go to a pretty high level and they talk about sort of mission and vision. Sometimes they'll just do a general description of what the company does. Sometimes there'll be this generic language about, we pursue high value opportunities to return best in industry returns for our shareholders. It's like, that's not a strategy. That you just described what all companies do, right? So there's no implicit goal in the strategy. And those are very safe. I think one reason people default to those is like, they go, yeah, like that's what we do. So that's good. And, we can do that every day. Just when I'm brushing my teeth, we're doing that. So that we're successful. At the other extreme, you ask people what their strategy is, and they go really down into the weeds, and they'll say, like, these are 10 priorities for this quarter. And so what strikes us is what's often missing is just this middle layer that in the book we call a simple plan, for lack of a better term. Mm-hmm. But it's just, a simple idea of what you are trying to achieve, and it's captured in a concise summary statement. We give full credit for this, by the way, to Dinesh Paliwala, who ran Harman International. This is where I first found this model for him that he used with his board of directors. It's a one-page exercise, summary statement of what you're trying to achieve. The next part is like, what are the 3 levers you got to pull to achieve that goal? Next part is, what are the challenges you have to overcome, the kind of reality check. This is why it's going to be difficult. And the fourth part is a scoreboard by which you can measure progress and success. And as soon as he said that, it really sort of clicked into shape for me that, this captures it all. There's a lot of strategy frameworks out there, KPIs and OKRs and Salesforce's V2MOM, and they work for the companies that use them. But just in our consulting work, this idea, this framework around the simple plan, it really lands well, and companies adopt it as kind of the shared language. And we've done enough of this work that I've also seen some of the watch outs, because, if you give a leadership team the exercise, okay, this is the framework, develop your simple plan. There's a couple of traps that I find people fall into. And probably the biggest one is what I call expertitis. And I saw this in all my years as an editor working with hundreds of reporters, that the people who develop the strategy documents may have grown up in the company, grown up in the industry, and they are suffering from this kind of noble disease, if you will, of being too much of an expert. And so what is clear and obvious to them, they think it's clear and obvious to everybody else, but it's not. And I don't need to tell you, Rita, you know this because of all the work that you do, but there's often a huge gap between how clear something is in the leader's head and everybody else. And then the final point I'll make on this is just this word priority, I've really come to focus on as a problematic word. And the problem with it is that it's kind of amorphous, right? It's a bit fuzzy. And I think if I had a magic wand, I would probably get rid of the word priority from the business world and replace it with outcomes. Because outcomes are, I think, point to much more specificity and this idea of what are you trying to achieve over whatever, like by the end of, of next year, what do we need to have achieved so that we can look back and say we had a really good year? Because priorities, the trap that falls into, you ask people for their list of priorities. And again, I know I'm telling you stuff Rita, but because you see this too, but very often those lists of priorities are way too long, right? And I think part of it is human nature. It's like people want to show that, we got their arms around the business. We want to recognize all the importance of all these different streams of work. But as a result of that, you don't get that kind of focus. And it's an interesting pattern. I've seen enough lists of priorities that I started seeing this pattern, which is I started seeing a lot of bullet points that began with the same first 2 words. And those 2 words are continue to. And I started asking myself, it's like, if you have to continue doing something, is it really a priority? I mean, as a human being, I need to continue to eat and continue to breathe and continue to sleep. But I don't know, those aren't really priorities, right? So, sometimes when I've done this in the moment with leadership teams or with large audiences, and you can sort of hear this chuckle of recognition. It's like, yeah, we have a lot of priorities that begin continue to. So.
That's interesting. I was just, in fact, last night reflecting on some work I did with the Kone company, which is an elevator company based out of Finland, and was part of their big transition when they really made a business model change from focusing on selling new elevators to focusing on maximizing the lifetime value of the elevator to its owners, which was that doesn't sound like a big deal. It's a huge deal. I mean, it's like different people are involved and different value proposition and everything different. But their CEO was Matti Alahuta at the time, who came over from Nokia, and very, very brilliant leader. He had 5 priorities, and he had 5 priorities in 2005. He had the same 5 priorities in 2006. He had the same 5 priorities in 2008. And when he finally stepped down from the company in 2014, guess what? He had the same 5 priorities. Right. It was amazing.
Yeah. And you see those leaders and they get it. I mean, I I would also put in that camp somebody like Bob Iger, who from the day he took over as CEO of Disney said, global expansion, great content, and embrace technology in all its forms. And he's never wavered from those. Those have become the through line of the company's growth. Mm-hmm. And to me, it is about that sweet spot of like, one of the pushbacks we sometimes hear from leadership teams when we're pushing them to do this exercise, a simple plan, is they go, this is obvious. Like, this is motherhood. This is apple pie. And then I always point him to the example of Bob Iger and Disney, because you can look at that and say, well, of course, like what else would it be? But that's the beauty of it. It's like, it seems obvious, but in the same way you see like, a really great New Yorker cartoon and go like, that's so obvious. Why didn't somebody do that already? To me, it has that sort of same feeling with when you get that simple plan right. Because again, it answers those sort of key questions like, what should I be working on and why is it important? Mm-hmm. And to me, there is this magic when you get it right. Everybody's you can just sort of see it cascading down through the organization. It lifts morale because everybody says, okay, now I see a path to winning and how I can contribute to that. And at the core of it all, I've interviewed by now more than 600 leaders, and I've always been asking myself, what is it that explains why all these people got to the corner office? Mm-hmm. And to me, the sort of red through line is this habit of mind that they can simplify complexity. Mm. Like all the other stuff to me is kind of table stakes. Like you got to have a lot of stamina and resilience and all that other stuff. But to me, the universal skill of the best leaders is that they can take the complexity of the industry they're operating in, the world at large, the company, the strategy, and boil it down to that moment where they can stand up at an all hands meeting, whether it's virtual or real. And I would say, like, you've got to answer the kinds of questions that little kids ask in the backseat, right? Like, where are we going? How are we going to get there? When are we going to get there? How do we know we're there? And that's a high and rare art form.
It's harder than it seems. And I think one of the skills of people who do this well is that they do make it look easy, right? And I joke about ballerinas, right? And you see the ballerina up on the stage and it looks effortless and they're smiling and it's fantastic. And you try to do the same thing, you're going to end up in traction. I mean, that's bad. So the book is, just for, in case I didn't mention, CEO Test, really 7 incredible lessons about CEOs. So some weeks back, I had Carter Copeland on one of my programs, and he's an analyst. We was with a company called Melius Research. And one of the things he points out that I thought was fascinating was the thing that gets him crazy is if he feels that he's not being leveled with, or that there's stuff being hidden, or that there's a backstory going on that they're not being honest with the street about. And I thought that was interesting. He's like, look, and he covers Boeing, companies like that, which have had their ups and downs over the years. He says, I'm willing to let them, I'm okay with that, but tell me honestly, like, just be straight with me about what's going on. Which brings up an interesting question when you think about strategy, right? And we're in this fascinating debate about shareholders versus everybody else. And are you seeing a sea change, a shift in that?
I think so. I mean, I know there's still some debate playing out about stakeholder versus shareholder capitalism, but to me, the debate is just, it's completely over. I think, as we've seen over the past year, questions about the role of corporations in society. I just think everybody needs to wake up to the fact that this stakeholder capital idea is here. And it's only going to become more pronounced. I mean, not only coming from big institutional investors who are making more demands around ESG, boards are holding the CEOs more accountable for like diversity and inclusion data and hitting their marks. But honestly, I think the big push is coming from employees. Like the year that we've been through, to me, has just felt like this incredible cultural stress test on companies. And the way that I've been thinking about it is that, when you think about how companies put together, some people use this phrase social architecture, which I like a lot. And to me, there's kind of 3 pillars of that social architecture. So some companies go, we need a mission and vision and purpose statement, Rita. Like let's hold an offsite and we'll come up with something. And boy, that feels really good. Yes, okay, we'll adopt that. Then they have a second
t-shirt. Gotta have a t-shirt.
Exactly. Then you have a second offsite. It's like, well, we need some values, right? I mean, every company. So let's excellence. Yeah, that's really good. What about integrity? Well, let's put that on there too, right? And then so that's done.
Didn't Enron have like integrity up on the wall?
Exactly. And I apologize for my dog in the background. And then the third part is, the strategy discussion. And I think in a lot of organizations, those have been completely separate. But I think what has happened over the past year, after George Floyd, all these companies made these announcements, pledges, commitments. And I think there's this moment we're living where people are holding the leaders more accountable. It's like, I know we say that, and I know you've been saying that, and you're saying this now, but what does that actually mean in practice? And so I think we are seeing a lot of companies revisiting them. And ultimately, I think it's going to drive to a better place, which is where the mission and purpose, the values and the strategy are much more built together as a complete whole, a three-legged stool, if you will. But to me, that's what we are going to see more of in the future. And the companies that get it right, I mean, a lot of people point to Microsoft as a good example of this. Just being very clear on what you stand for. What are the issues that you are going to take an activist stance on, and how that fits into your strategy. You get that right, and that's going to have this incredible accelerator effect. And it's also going to be a bigger draw for talent, for both attracting and retaining talent. I mean, to me, like that's the narrative I'm starting to see more of now, and I'm pretty convinced we're going to see even more of it in the future.
Well, and you talk in the book about culture as your number 2 test, right? Which is, do you walk the talk? Do you symbolically, but also substantively map what you're talking about to what's actually going on?
Yeah, exactly. And, all the companies go through the values exercise. When I do lectures at exec ed classes, and, if I'm giving a talk on culture, I'll say, everybody in the audience works at a company. So I'll say, just quick show of hands, how many of you know your company's values? It is very rare that more than 40% of the hands go up. And Kevin and I had some interesting discussions because I generally favor shorter lists, ideally short enough that they're memorable. He's not so wedded to that notion. For Kevin, it's much more about the specificity of the behaviors behind the values. But Kevin and I do agree that, at the core of it is creating this culture of like, these are the values, these are the behaviors underneath. And then the test becomes, do you enforce them, right? Do you put up with the high performing jerk who directly contradicts the values and everybody knows it, which makes everybody cynical, or do you act on that? I sometimes, the metaphor that I use for company is like every company's culture is like its own sport, right? In the same way that every country's culture is different, every company's culture is different. And the values in many ways are like, these are the rules of this sport, right? This is how we're going to play this game. And that's fine. So to me, then the X factors become like, how clear are you about what those rules are? And then the really important part are like, are there referees on the field, right? Because it's like, okay, I know what the rules are, but I'm playing dirty and I'm getting away with it. And I'm getting ahead because I'm playing dirty. Everybody recognizes that. It's like, oh, so no refs on the field. Got it. And that's why, you step back and say, why do some company cultures go off the rails? I mean, they're not bad people, right? And I just think at some level, as human beings, we all have the best and worst versions of ourselves inside us. And then the culture brings that out depending on the context it creates.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And you talk about the third test being creating true teams. And there's a wonderful quote from Kevin on politics that I just thought was such a great story. I wonder if you mind repeating that one.
Sure. So when he was president of Amgen for many years and then became CEO and recruited a new team. And he tells the story, brought them all together for this dinner just outside the company headquarters in Los Angeles, and had some good, laughs and small talk beforehand. But then he sort of shifted the tone and started this conversation to say, okay, sports fans. And he said, this is how it's going to be. And he said, look, I'm I know how to play politics. How do you think I got this job? But I'm not going to put up with any politics. And if any of you try and do that, it's going to be me. It's going to be like me being a parent watching a 4-year-old try to work him. Like, that's how obvious and transparent it's going to be. And as soon as I see that, you're gone. And, I imagine there was quite a moment of silence. But what I love about that story is just sort of Kevin made it very clear, right? I'm not going to put up with it. I'm going to see it in a second. Don't think you can get away with it. And you can say it's like, wow, that sounds like a pretty tough boss. But to me, it's, look, most leadership teams at big companies, the people on those teams have all the money they need, right? But his leadership team, save for one executive, his entire leadership team stayed with him for 12 years. And I think teams appreciate just that. It sort of goes back to like the sport point I made, right? Like, these are the rules, and I am going to be the referee, and I'm going to see any dirty play, because I'm mixing metaphors here. I think I always make the joke, Rita, that there's a reason why HBO ran Game of Thrones on Sunday night, which is to get people ready for work the next day. Because I think that's how a lot of leadership teams operate. Like, this is a zero-sum game. If I'm going to win, you've got to lose. I've got to take you down. And people are fighting for resources and attention. And that's kind of human nature, right? And so that's why I think the leader of the team has to provide such a powerful counterweight to say, these are the rules of engagement. To me, that's like such an important, and I've seen too many leadership teams where everybody in the leadership team, they've got the right impulse. Because you say, when we do work with leadership teams, like, what do you guys want from each other? The answer is always the same. It's like, we want to have each other's back, right? We want to trust each other. And it's like, so everybody starts with that impulse. It's the right impulse. It's a good one, but it breaks down because of this, like, wow, that person seems to be spending a lot of time in the CEO's office. Like, are they throwing me under the bus? Right. And that then brings out that Game of Thrones behavior.
It does, yeah. Safi Bahcall is the author of a book, Loonshots, and he makes the observation that, culture may eat strategy for breakfast, but structure eats culture for lunch. And he talks about designing the incentives in a very, very explicit way, because he raises this issue of politics. And he says, the minute people get more out of behaving in a political way than they do out of doing what's for everybody's best interest, you're down the road to ruin, basically.
Yeah. And on that point of incentives, just to build on that, Rita, I mean, we share the example from Dinesh Paliwal, who I mentioned before, the CEO of Harman International. And he said his sort of bonus incentive structure is, the higher you went up in the organization, the more it was kind of a shared bonus structure. Mm-hmm. And to the point of his leadership team, like, everybody was got the same bonus, but depending on the company's overall performance. And he was quite open about the fact that, sometimes somebody on his team would come to him and say, look, my division is killing it. And, Bob's division's really having a tough time. I kind of feel like I'm carrying him on this. And he would just be very upfront with him. He goes, well, 3 years ago, he carried you. And 2 years from now, he may be carrying you again, but we're a team and this is how it's going to be. And, it's just kind of setting those very simple rules. And I do think leadership at some level is kind of like parenting, right? Like, you've got to say, look, these are the rules. This is the why behind them. And yes, I mean them. Right?
And you can't get around mom by going to dad.
Right. I'm starting to get some gray hairs, Rita. And, I had this insight a few years ago, which is I feel like society has a fundamental perspective about life wrong, which is that most people look at children as young adults. And at some point I realized, what? Adults are just older children. And once you realize that, it's like, wow, that makes a lot of sense, right? And I was a manager for many years. And, I mentioned Nell Minow earlier, and she had this great insight from me early on when I interviewed her for Corner Office. It really stayed with me. She said, when you're a manager, most of the time when people come into your office, it's for one of two reasons. One of them is to say, look what I did. And you go, wow, you did it in red. Can you do it in blue? Like, good for you. And the other one is like, he's playing with my stuff. It's like, well, did you talk to him? And ever since she said that, stayed with me. In all my years as a manager, somebody wanted to talk to me. And I was saying to myself, it's like, it's not always one of those two things, but it very often is.
That's fascinating. You're absolutely right. And then, people look to you to resolve conflicts or, whatever. So on the team, in the team chapter, you talk about something that I think we don't have enough guidance on, which is what happens when you have to move somebody off the team, not because they're a bad person or they mean badly or anything like that, but they're just, it's not working or they're not keeping up or and you talk about the importance of doing that for everybody else, that you're tolerating, not tolerating is too strong a word, not recognizing when that's going on is a real leadership shortcoming.
Yeah, it's interesting. And, in addition to my 600 plus interviews with CEOs, I've also interviewed every one of the mentors in my firm. I've got 35 mentors. They're all former CEOs, and they're working with clients in the C-suite. And I asked them, I said, when you talk to your clients, like, what are the two biggest themes that come up, the most important ones? And they said strategy and teams, getting a clear strategy and the teams. And it's interesting. The way those conversations usually play out is our mentors will ask the clients, like, tell me about your team. And they'll say, oh, the team's great. They're all really hardworking. They're good people, really loyal. Everybody gets along really well. It's like, how's your team performing? And how are the individuals? Like, I don't want to ask like what great people they are, but what is their performance level? And once you start sort of going down and having a real conversation with that, then there's this kind of aha moment, which is maybe my team isn't as good as I thought it was. And again, we keep talking in our discussion about human nature. And I think this is another example of this. I mean, you want the people on your leadership team to succeed, right? Very often you've hired them, you've bet on them, you spend more hours with them than your own family, you're in tough situations together. And it can very often start feeling like, well, these people are our family, and you start kind of excusing away behavior in the same way that you do with, your Uncle Bob or whatever, right? I mean, it's the difference between, a lot of companies say we're a family. It's like, no, you're not a family. You're a team, because with your family, you can't fire Uncle Bob, right? And you sort of get into this mindset. And I think what happens is that some people just start, it happens slowly and subtly, but you just start excusing behavior that should be not good enough. Right. But you're just saying, well, this is a person on my team, and if I replace them, they'd be so disruptive. And I don't know if the person I'd get to replace them is any better. And it just starts this slippery slope. And if Kevin were on this call, he would say, look, what he's learned from all his years is like number 1, 2, and 3 is it all starts with a team. You've got to have a great leadership team. And one of the things we talk about in that chapter, and I heard this from a guy named Bruce Gordon, who's he's also the CFO at our firm, but he was a top executive at Disney Interactive, and he talked about what he called the golden age of teams, of management teams. And his point, you sort of step back from your career, and he said, if you are lucky as an executive with leadership teams over the entire career, you might have like 3 periods that are kind of golden ages of your leadership team, where everybody's great, everybody's contributing, and it's fun because you're winning. He said those individual golden ages probably won't last more than 2 years each, because people get promoted and move on to other stuff. But it was such a great insight, because it asks this provocative question, which is the team you have now good enough to give you one of those golden ages? Mm-hmm. And if not, what are you going to do about it? So to me, it's such a tricky, to your point, it's such a tricky thing. Like, where do you set the bar for good enough or not good enough?
Mm-hmm. Well, I love the idea of the real dynamics that comes across in the book and in this conversation. So I'm carrying Bob this year, but Bob may be carrying me next year. I've got this great golden age going on now, but 2 years from now that may fall apart. And that's really interesting, because I don't think in our popular narrative we pay enough attention to that. So Ron, who I mentioned to you earlier, and I are writing this article on the pitfalls of transformation, which is what I was going to ask you about next. Yeah. And when it goes wrong, it's just so often a function of, this person wasn't on board, or that person was unwilling. Or one of the most tricky ones, I think, is this J curve. Like, we have this mental image that a good CEO takes a company on a perpetual stream of the upside of an S curve, right? We don't realize, we're not prepared to be understanding when there's this J curve of poorer performance in between jumping on the two. And so let's talk about transformation, because I think even today we talk about it as though it's this weird, unusual thing. And in your book, you talk about it as, you're going to be CEO, you're going to have to deal with it, right?
Right. And just, a lot of people like to put adjectives or words in front of the words leadership, like change leadership. And it's like, and the argument we make in the book is like, we need to stop doing that. Like, if you're a leader, you're always in the middle of transformation, right? And if you're not, you should be. It's just another part of the job that is a constant. I mean, we've lived through the 12 years prior to the pandemic of a pretty stable world. And I think we can all agree that that's probably not going to be with us again. So just this idea of, how to drive transformation. And I think people recognize that there is, I always like to frame things like, what's the bad movie version of this? And what's the good movie version of this? And we've all seen this sort of bad movie version of like the new CEO comes in, talks to a dozen people or more, locks him or herself in the office, comes out and says, I've got the new transformation plan. And then you just get the classic sort of organ rejection, right? Like, and because I do think you have to treat all your employees like volunteers and get them to sort of sign up for the mission. But we do share 3 case studies in that chapter of different companies in different contexts, like of urgency and how you go about doing that. But I think really the core of it is, it's almost going back to your J curve, Rita, of like, you have to spend some time, as much as there's this incredible demand and urgency for pulling off the transformation, just making sure that there's like a lot of buy-in at the leadership team level, so that everybody's bought in rather than crossing their fingers under the table, making sure that everybody's up for the change. Because Mark Thompson at the New York Times, I know it's obviously an example close to home for me because I worked there for 18 years, but everybody's pointing to the Times as just this remarkable example of transformation from a print, paper-centric organization to digitally focused. Just all the time that he put in, they set up these Friday afternoon standing meetings where they would meet for 6 hours, and just like that took months. And very often they had conversations that didn't go anywhere, but just kind of creating this environment. It's like, we are going to work through this together, and it's going to take some time, but we are eventually going to crack this code, making sure that it then cascades down through the organization, making sure all the ideas bubble up from below, communicating it relentlessly, taking all the questions. I mean, it's just, making sure that there's a sense that everybody has a voice and opinion in this. And I do think there's this moment that I think a lot of leaders struggle with, where you come up with a plan. Again, you could go back to that sort of standing on the stage at the all hands meeting, and where you say sort of, this is the new plan. And I think you have to be prepared for at least one, if not many more employees putting up their hand and saying, but how do we know if this is going to work? Right? Which is a pretty darn good question. And I think the best answer for that, I heard it from a guy named John Riccitello, who runs Unity Technologies, but his speech, his short monologue when asked that, is like, I'm not 100% certain this is going to work. Nobody can be 100% certain, but what I need is everybody to commit 100% to trying to make this work. And if we get any new data from the marketplace that it isn't working, we're going to respond quickly, pivot as needed, and I'll communicate that to you. And I think it's just a big part of it is like acknowledging the uncertainty, because we all know it's like human beings crave status quo. They don't like uncertainty. Uncertainty means risk, which means threats to their livelihood and all that. So people resist it. I like the story. I just recently interviewed the CHR at Coca-Cola, and during the pandemic, they did a big transformation effort. And there was an interesting story there. They offered pretty generous buyouts to pretty much everybody in the organization with pretty low eligibility thresholds. But they basically said to them, we are going through a big transformation. It's going to change the way what we do, how we do it, the nature of your job. And we're offering these severances, these buyouts, because if at this point in your career, you're not up for this, we totally get it. And we want to help you land to wherever you want to be. But just know that we're going to go through a big change. And the CHRO said, look, as a company that probably cost us more than maybe we needed to spend, but just to send that really important cultural signal, it's like, we are going to change. We are embarking on this new direction. And if you're not up for it, it's time to step off the boat.
Absolutely. So my buddy Ann Kurtzenberger wants to know, when you talk to CEOs about the things they regret, are there some common themes?
And do you mean a personal level or professional level?
I guess a little of each.
Yeah. Look, I'm at a personal level, I think we can all recognize that these C-suite jobs, especially the CEOs, I mean, they're 24/7 jobs, right? And I think just the reality of them is that it's hard to, even for most of us, this idea of work-life balance is pretty quixotic, right? But for CEOs, and I think there's some recognition of lost time there. It just goes with the territory. In terms of regrets professionally, I haven't heard clear themes there. Yeah, nothing leaps to mind.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So together with transformation, you talk about really listening. And the way I talk about that is, getting out to the edges, and you got a whole chapter on that, which I think is great. But then this notion of handling a crisis, and you mentioned before taking the time, slowing down the game.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Like, because, we have this mental image, I think, of, a leader in crisis is in motion and, commanding and, up on the ramparts or whatever. Right. And you're talking about, no, actually what you need to do is take a deep breath, try to get some perspective and spend the time.
Right. It can be hard. And I will say that because we started the book project before the pandemic hit. And then we were living in the crisis as we were finishing the book. And, obviously we needed a chapter, because if you ask yourselves, why do leaders succeed or fail in those roles? Handling a crisis is obviously one of those core 7 tests. So we had to write a chapter, but it's hard to write that chapter when you're in the middle of something. So it was the last chapter we turned in. But we just, part of the insight was developing this framework. It's like, okay, let's acknowledge there's 2 kinds of crisis. There's the crisis like COVID, which is like the tsunami that rolls around the world that affects everybody in the same way, right? Nobody's to blame. We're all in this together, as a leader of your organization. That's a very different crisis than, say, the one that Kevin managed, where it happened at his company because of some, process and procedural failing on their part. Those are very different kinds of crises and require different responses. The second one first, this idea of something happens on your watch, on your team, your business unit, your division, your company. And the biggest single mistake that people make is that they say things that they don't know. They sort of mentally circle the wagons. There's a little bit of disbelief. This can't be happening. And there's a little bit of magical thinking that I just want to wish this away. So if you've had a data breach that affected 40 million customers, you're going to say, well, it's not going to be any more than that. And then sure enough, 3 months later, it turns out to be 110 million customers and when you do that, you instantly lose credibility. So the first rule of crisis management is don't say anything you don't know. And it's a fairly simple and straightforward playbook. And just, communicate, say, we recognize the issue. We're going to get to the bottom of it. Once we do, we're going to fix whatever needs to be fixed so it doesn't happen again. You communicate with all the stakeholders, et cetera, et cetera. But it is amazing how, when you're in the moment, you're overwhelmed. I mean, the metaphor we use in the book is like you're in a tiny lifeboat in the middle of this, or a sailboat in the middle of this storm hitting. And, you may know all the basics of, like, you got to do this with a tiller and this with a sail and all that, but it can be hard in the stress of the moment. But the CEOs, I mean, the people who are in the business of crisis management, consultants and the like, I have to think that they just kind of say the same simple things over and over. It's like, first rule is don't say anything you don't know. It's like, oh boy, that was really helpful. Right? But again, I am sympathetic.
You
And
talk about being confident, but also human.
yeah, and so that's, to me, what's been so interesting. The crisis that we've been living through is just the leadership challenge that creates. And to me, we also touch on this in the last chapter, but just these sort of balancing acts of, you need different responses in different moments, because in the middle of, COVID, everybody sort of tightened down their budget, right? So you need to be realistic about what this could mean for the health of your organization. And yet people only follow confident leaders, right? And it's your job to come up with a path to success. And so you have to be able to balance those. This past year has been more humanity has been required of leaders, right? Just the simple question, like, how are you doing, Rita? No, I want to know, how are you doing in this moment? So more humanity, more compassion. And yet, on the other hand, you also need to be demanding sometimes and hold people accountable for all the stuff that everybody's dealing with at home. There still has to be, we are crashing this project. This is crucial to business. I need you to basically clear your calendar I know you've got a lot going on, but you've got to clear your calendar for the next 2 days. And knowing the right impulse at the right moment has just been this incredible challenge and balancing act for leaders. And ultimately, you can only do that based on kind of gut and experience.
Interesting. So Rick Goings, who you probably know, he was the former CEO of Tupperware, among many other interesting roles. And he's interested in CEOs looking at the world through an American lens, and those that are able to overcome that. Do you have any observations on that?
In terms of different styles of leadership, or? Yeah, I'm not sure I've got any great insights there. I mean, I do think, because I've interviewed, as I said, coming on 700 leaders by now, and most of them based in the U.S., but a lot of people from outside the U.S. And I think, there is this expectation, I think it's growing, of our leaders that you do be vulnerable, that you do show your humanity, that you are kind of open and authentic. This is what we are increasingly expecting of our leaders. And I think culturally that's, there's a little more of that in the US than there is in some countries. I mean, I've interviewed leaders who, maybe grew up in Japan and started working in the United States. And they have shared with me their stories of how they just had to learn to become more open. So I think that's one of the cultural differences. That set aside, I mean, the 7 tests we focus on in the book, to me, these are just the universal tests of all leadership. We really tried to focus on this idea of, this is what leaders do, and that they have to do well to succeed in their jobs, and this is how to do them.
And the last test you talk about, so just to summarize, it's what you call the inner game of leadership. And I think that's interesting. And the phrase that I just took note of was, he knew who he was. Right. So can you expand on that? Because I don't think we talk enough about it. We certainly don't talk about listening and knowing who you are and self-awareness in business school much.
No, exactly. And as I mentioned, there's 7 tests in the book. The first 6 are about what leaders need to do. And this last chapter about the inner game is framed around how you need to be as a leader. And look, leadership is incredibly hard. Everybody knows this, I think. And you sort of step back and say, well, why is it so hard? And I think anybody who's relatively new to leadership or wants to become a better leader, you start looking for advice, and it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that there is just so much contradictory advice out there. Mm-hmm. Right? Everybody says, like, lead from the back, lead from the front. And, you got to be urgent, you got to be patient, you got to be compassionate, you got to be demanding. You just keep going down the list, and it's like, it's all contradictory. And I think what is hard for a lot of leaders is like, well, which one is it? Like, what am I supposed to do? I'm trying to build my own leadership style, and I want a little bit of this, but it's not really working, because human beings are complicated and every context is different. And what having interviewed so many leaders, and almost every single one of them has been in person, I've always been struck by the look that I see in their eyes. And I always think like eye contact is the 5G of communication, where you can really tell a lot just by looking somebody in the eye. And I was struck by how many of them, they seemed calm. and confident and not arrogant, but just this, to me, this sort of 3 C's of calm, confident, and incredible. And I've often thought about, well, how do you given how hard these jobs are, and given that there's sort of infinite demands at every minute coming from all angles, how do you do that when every response, every moment may demand a different response? And so in the book, we talk about, all these things that are seeming contradictions, these paradoxes. That is why leadership is so hard, and that people shouldn't think about, well, do I do this or that? The answer is and, not or, and that these are and propositions, and you have to understand them as paradoxes, and sort of, start with understanding the balance point, and then say, okay, does this moment demand a sense of urgency or patience? And just knowing which way to flex. But if you can understand everything about leadership as paradoxes, it does create this, okay, there's a calm, centered place that I can start from and just flex according to as I need. And I think you build on top of that. I think the best leaders are quite self-aware. They're honest with themselves about what their strengths are. But I often think about this word authenticity that a lot of people use. And then if you double click on that and say, well, what does that mean exactly? And I think part of it is this self-awareness and, again, kind of knowing what you're good and bad at. But I think a lot of it comes from knowing what you stand for and what your personal values are. And again, it's not the obvious stuff like I believe in excellence and integrity, but it's more like, what are the things I'm not going to compromise on in the way I lead and manage people? And if I'm put in some kind of stress test on those things, I am going to remain consistent. Even if I have to sacrifice something, maybe a promotion, because I'm not going to throw my employees under the bus. Like, I think having a very clear sense of your own value system, I think that all feeds into that authenticity. I know who the person is. I know who I am. And again, you can just see it in the body language. You can see it in the eyes of leaders.
That's fascinating. That is fascinating. Well, I'm glad you pulled it together for us in the book. Do you see any big differences, or should there be differences between men and women as leaders?
I wondered that myself when I started doing Corner Office, and from the very start, I said I'm going to interview a lot of women and
you
people.
You mentioned a lot of women in the book.
Yes,
I mean, it's noticeable. How many more women than pop up in your typical business book?
Exactly. And when I launched Corner Office in 2009, I said I'm going to interview a lot of women, a lot of people of color, and I'm not going to ask them any race or gender specific questions. I'm just going to interview them, everybody the same way, as leaders first and only. And I did find myself thinking early on, it's like I kept looking for the patterns. And ultimately, I decided, you know what, there is no difference in terms of gender deciding your leadership style. I think it's much more other factors like, are you an introvert, an extrovert? Are you firstborn or middle child? Like, to me, that's where you start seeing more patterns of leadership. When I was doing the Corner Office interview series, I always started with the same 3 questions, which is, tell me about when you were a kid, tell me about your parents, and how have your parents influenced your leadership style? And the stories that I would get from that would much more unlock the answer to the question of, like, why do you lead the way you do? Much more than gender for me. So
that's interesting. That's really interesting. I mean, Thomas Tomorrow for Music, who you may know of, he says one of the problems we have when we pick leaders is we confuse confidence with competence. Right. And therefore, a lot of people who exhibit a lot of confidence but aren't actually very competent get
exactly
roles.
Exactly. And I remember seeing a study where, narcissists tend to get the promotions too. Right. And it's like, well, why does that? And it's like, we could talk all day about that, but yeah. I think that's a pattern.
Well, the time has absolutely flown. How do people learn more? How do they get to be part of Adam's world?
I've got a website. It's adambryantbooks.com. So go there. And I've written a couple of other books as well, but really enjoyed spending time with you, Rita. So admire all the work you've done. So this has been an honor.
Thank you so much. And everybody whose questions we didn't get to, we will follow up afterwards. And I'll make sure to send you a copy of the questions as well, Adam. So you'll have that set to think about. So thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend. Thank you, Adam, for spending an hour with us. It's been really inspiring. Thank you.
That's great. Great.